Hello and welcome to this interview at The Wire. Today we will be talking to Michael Mann, who's one of the world's leading climate scientists, and he was among the first ones to identify the role human beings have played in global warming. You might have seen his famous hockey stick chart of 1998 that showed that temperatures in the northern hemisphere have increased rapidly in the 20th century. If not that, you must have seen some version of it which tells the story of warming across the world caused by human activity. We will be talking to him today about his new book, The New Climate War. Welcome, Michael. First of all, how have you been? How has quarantine been?
Thanks, Kabir. It's good to be with you. We're doing okay here in Pennsylvania. People are starting to get vaccinated, so there's some light at the end of the tunnel. But a lot of Americans are behaving a little prematurely, going out and exposing themselves even before they've had vaccinations. So there's some nervousness about that, but I think we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, I wish I could say the same about India. That's not happening here, but let's hope.
Best of luck. Best of luck to you folks.
Let's hope this is over soon. So coming to your book, it's called The New Climate War. Starting with the title, help us break down the title itself. What is the new climate war and who is the enemy?
Yeah, so it's hard to answer that question without talking about what the old climate war was. The enemy is the same. Fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda, conservative media outlets, conservative politicians, front groups, industry front groups that advocate for the fossil fuel industry. We're engaged in this effort to discredit the fundamental science of climate change, to convince the public that the science is flawed, untrustworthy, that the scientists can't be trusted, in an effort to keep us addicted to fossil fuels, because the implications of climate change are profound when it comes to the fossil fuel industry. We have to stop burning fossil fuels if we're to stop the accumulation of carbon pollution in the atmosphere. The fossil fuel industry doesn't want that. They want us to stay addicted to fossil fuels. And so they've fought tooth and nail to keep us addicted. And for a long time, it was through an elaborate public relations campaign aimed at discrediting science itself. Here's the problem. It's impossible to deny climate change today to the public when they can see it playing out with their own two eyes. And here in India, you've seen withering heat waves in recent years around the world. We've seen unprecedented extreme weather events, floods and heat waves and wildfires and droughts, superstorms that have collectively opened our eyes to the reality of the climate crisis. And so the forces of inaction, I call them the inactivists in the book, they know they can't deny climate change is happening anymore, but they still want to keep us addicted to fossil fuels. And so they're now using other ever more insidious tactics in their effort to prevent us from moving off of fossil fuels. And that involves tactics like division, dividing climate advocates, getting them arguing with each other online on social media to divide the community so that it doesn't speak with a united voice. Deflection, so that's division. And there are a bunch of words that start with D. There's a little bit of alliteration here, you'll note, because these are the tactics. There's division. There is deflection. Deflecting attention away from the need for systemic changes, for policies, governmental policies to decarbonize our economy, deflecting attention away from that by focusing inordinately on individual behavior, as if it's simply a matter of lifestyle choices, of individual lifestyle changes. And of course, there are lots of lifestyle changes that we can and should make to decrease our environmental impact. But those alone aren't going to solve the problem. We need governmental incentives that move us collectively away from fossil fuels. And they don't want that to happen. So they've focused attention and they've really gotten the media to play into that framing. There's so many articles about how we can change our diet or our travel, and to the point where it becomes almost the sole focus of climate action, and it crowds out the discussion about systemic changes. Then there is doom and despair mongering. Ironically, if they can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, that potentially leads us down that same path of disengagement as outright denial. And they don't care about the path we take, they just care about the destination. They want us disengaged. And they don't care if it's because we deny that climate change is even happening, or we deny that there's any possibility of doing anything about it anymore. There are tactics to delay action, another D word, proposing false solutions, geoengineering, massive carbon capture, the promise of technologies down the road that they say can be used to solve the problem that serve as a crutch for fossil fuel interests when it comes to decreasing carbon pollution now. If they can say, hey, we can solve this problem with technology 10 years down the road, don't worry about it. So let us keep burning carbon in the meantime. Of course, it may very well be that these elaborate techno fixes won't work. And if we don't act now, we will be faced with truly catastrophic warming. And so, you know, this is sometimes referred to as moral hazard. The idea, the promise of a techno fix down the road is a very useful strategy for polluting interests to convince us that we don't have to worry today. And so these are among the main tactics that we're seeing deployed in the new climate war. And, you know, we are so close now to achieving action on a global scale. And so the reason I wrote this book is because we're so close, and yet there are still these obstacles that are being thrown in our path by the forces of inaction, and people need to recognize them and fight back against them so that we can rise to the challenge.
So in a sense, in many senses, this is a very wide scope that this book has taken. And it is also, one feels, it's a very political book as well, right? And scientists usually tend to avoid politics.
That's right.
Why did you feel it was necessary for you to delve into these issues?
Well, as I like to say, I didn't come to politics. Politics came to me. 2 decades ago, when my co-authors and I published the now famous hockey stick curve that you mentioned earlier, it became this galvanizing symbol in the climate change debate. And suddenly I found myself at the very center of the contentious public debate over climate change. It's not what I signed up for. It's not what I had planned for when I double majored in applied math and physics at UC Berkeley and went off to study theoretical physics, Yale University. I didn't realize that ultimately I was going down a path that would lead me into the center of the most contentious debate that we've ever had. But because of the hockey stick and the iconic significance that it took on, that's where I found myself. And very quickly, I found myself descended upon by the forces of inaction, conservative media outlets, Republican senators and congressmen attacking me, trying to, subpoena all of my personal emails. I had an attorney general from Virginia who came after me, tried to use, again, sort of a civil subpoena to intimidate me, to force me and my co-authors to turn over massive amounts of documents. I had congressmen who, demanded that I appear in a hostile show trial where they would try to discredit my work. I've had threats against my family, against my own life, demands, again, by climate change deniers, individuals affiliated with the various groups that advocate for the fossil fuel industry, front groups, who have worked to demand that I be fired from my job at Penn State University, basically using every tactic in the playbook to try to intimidate me. So, as I said, I didn't come to politics. Politics came to me. But ultimately, I realized that, this focus on me and my research potentially provided me with an opportunity to use that productively, to use that for good, to try to use the platform that I now had to actually educate the public and policymakers about the science and its implications. So I have ultimately come to embrace that role. I feel privileged to be in a position to influence this conversation. But it wasn't really by my choosing. I was a reluctant participant in the climate wars, and ultimately I've come to embrace that role. But it's certainly not what an education in science prepares you for. A whole different set of rules of engagement that you need to learn when you leave the scientific sphere and the academic sphere and you're in the public sphere, especially when it comes to a very contentious issue like climate change, where powerful vested interests are working hard to poison the public dialogue and to influence policy.
But we are surely now, you would say, that past the stage of climate denialism, that climate change is now, like you said, we see it in our lives.
Yeah.
Right? We see it every year. Like the last time I spoke to you, we were Australia. You were in Australia, and we witnessed the Australian bushfires, where 3 billion animals either died or lost their habitat. This year, Australia was visited by floods, not of the same scale, but again, forest fires and floods in pretty much the same year. So we see this happening every day. So are we past the stage of climate denialism, that nobody really can deny that this is happening, and humans have contributed to it?
Yeah, I testified just the other day to the Australian Parliament, and I found it remarkable that there were still a number of conservative senators from the Liberal Party, which is the conservative party there, who actually were challenging the science. But though they are few and far between, and they're no longer very relevant. The media almost treats it as a joke, the Australian media. So I think the Black Summer, as it was called, we were both there for that. This unprecedented summer of heat and drought and bushfires that literally blanketed the continent of India. I think collectively, that really awakened the Australian public and their media to the reality of the problem. And I think that, Australia is really moved on. We're denial, and despite the fact that Murdoch media have continued to try to promote denialism, even they are moving away from outright denial to these other tactics, to delay and division and deflection. We see that in the messaging even from the Murdoch media. And so that tells us that the forces of inaction have decided they've lost the old climate war, the war against the science, but they haven't given up. And so it's this new climate war that the Murdoch media are promoting in Australia. The hearing was actually about the undue influence that the Murdoch media has, and how pernicious that has been when it comes to the public good with regard to issues like climate change that are now presenting a real crisis for Australians. And then in India, of course, you've seen unprecedented flooding events and heat waves in recent years. That's the face of climate change, and we can all see it now.
Okay, moving on, like you argue in your book that we have to move away from overemphasizing the importance of individual actions like flying less or eating less meat. Is their role in averting the climate catastrophe overstated? But surely the aviation industry and the meat industry contribute a huge amounts of emissions. They account for a lot. So would individual actions not help?
Yeah, so individual actions absolutely do help. And I encourage people, in the book, we should all do those things that we can do in our everyday lives that, decrease our environmental impact and our carbon footprint. And in many cases, these are things that make us healthier, they make us feel better. They set a good example for other people. They save us money. So, I drive a plug-in hybrid vehicle. I don't eat meat. We get our electricity entirely from renewable energy. We've elected to pay extra for a plan where all of our electricity comes from wind, and then we're charging our car off of our electrical outlet. So we're charging our car on wind, and it feels great to know that we're part of something bigger, this larger trend, and we feel good about it. And it sets a good example. What we can't do is allow polluters to focus our attention so exclusively on individual behavior that it crowds out sort of our support for systemic changes. And there is some literature in the social science literature that suggests that can happen if people feel like they are doing a lot in their individual lives already to deal with the problem. They may not be as supportive. For example, policies. The idea is, well, look, I've changed my diet. I'm driving a more fuel-efficient vehicle. I'm doing all these things, and now you're telling me I have to pay a carbon tax on top of it. So we have to be careful that individual behavior isn't used as a distraction from systemic change. And it's no mystery why British Petroleum, BP, gave us the very first individual carbon footprint calculator back in the early 2000s, because BP and fossil fuel companies want us so focused on our individual carbon footprint that we fail to recognize theirs. And 70% of the carbon emissions come from just 100 polluting corporations and companies. So now when it comes to, for example, our diet, our travel, whether we fly, again, we should all try to cut back to the extent we possibly can. It sets a good example. And to me, that's what's important. Let's set a good, positive example for other people so that they may adopt these same behaviors. But what can actually end up backfiring is if we point fingers and shame people for the fact that they're eating meat or engaging in other carbon unfriendly behaviors. The literature shows that can have a backfire effect. That can actually cause them to double down in their behavior because they feel like they're being attacked. So when it comes to meat, by the way, it's only about 15% of global carbon emissions come from livestock, about 25% from agriculture and livestock in total. So it's not trivial. It's part of our carbon emissions, and we do need policies that incentivize carbon-friendly agriculture, and that can mean policies to help people move away from meat towards healthier alternatives, incentives for them doing that. There are economic incentives that we can provide to farmers to engage in carbon-friendly agricultural sort of approaches, agricultural actions, agricultural there are ways that we can manage land, we can manage agriculture to decrease carbon emissions. You can even feed livestock different food stocks that lead to less methane production, which is part of the problem from ruminants like cows and sheep. So yeah, there's a lot that we can do there, and there's no magic bullet. If we're going to solve this problem, we've got to decarbonize energy and transportation. That's a big chunk. But we also have to decarbonize agriculture and everything else. And it's going to take an all hands on deck approach and a sort of cross-government approach.
So the focus should rather be on systemic changes and changing the way the industry as a whole, if any particular industry functions, rather than on emphasizing how individuals should do it.
I think, again, incentives, we should provide incentives for people to change behavior. And that was part of the pandemic. We saw that by making changes in behavior, we could actually decrease global carbon emissions. They came down 7% last year, in substantial part because of the changes in behavior in response to the pandemic. Of course, that's going to go away. It hasn't gone away yet. And I know India is still very much dealing with this crisis. But a year or so down the road, we'll largely be looking back in the rearview mirror at the pandemic, at that crisis, and we will have an even larger, hopefully a year or so. And all of us will have lost friends and loved ones. So it's a tragedy by any measure, and we will never completely leave it behind. But the acute crisis the health crisis, public health crisis, will largely be behind us, but an even larger crisis will still be looming there, and that's the climate crisis.
Has the pandemic, speaking of the pandemic, has that given you any learnings on how we will deal with the climate crisis? I mean, they are very different crises. The climate crisis is drawn out over a longer period of time, so we may not see the impact, we may not see the immediacy needed to act in the climate crisis, which we saw with the pandemic. And that's why everything happened, which was needed. But do you see any learnings? Like, even with the vaccine rollout, we see that the rich nations have managed to vaccinate a large proportion of their population than the poorer. So that is something that the climate crisis that is also happening with regard, especially with finance made available to developing countries who are also most at risk of due to or most vulnerable to climate change. So do you see any learnings?
I mean, the pandemic really can serve as a prism through which we can view sort of all of the challenges we face as a civilization right now, because all of them were evident really with the pandemic. The sort of income inequality and wealth inequality, and how much more those with the least resources, to the developing world versus the industrial world, but even within countries like the United States, within industrial nations, poorer communities have less resources, have less resilience, had less access to, the treatments and the vaccines. And so it really did highlight so many of the same basic challenges that we must overcome to address the climate crisis. And in the book, I spend a whole section in the final chapter on the lessons that we can learn from the pandemic when it comes to the climate crisis. But you could write a whole book about the lessons that we could learn about the climate crisis from the pandemic. We saw, the role, how deadly misinformation and science denial can be. It led literally to hundreds of thousands of lost lives in the United States because we had a president who was driven by an ideological agenda to pretend that we didn't have a problem and to discourage all the practices that our public health officials told us we needed to be engaging in if we were going to address this crisis. But because we had a president who saw his prospects for re-election as hinging upon the denial of the basic science, suggesting we had a health crisis on our hands, that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. So science denial is deadly. We learned that lesson with the pandemic. It holds even more true with the climate crisis. If we fail to act on this crisis, a far greater number of lives will be lost in the future than with the pandemic. We saw, we learned, and I think you alluded to this we learned sort of about our vulnerability, right? How vulnerable we are to this microscopic organism that has turned human civilization upside down so easily. And that tells us something about the vulnerability of our basic infrastructure, our societal infrastructure, with nearly 8 billion people on the planet competing for finite food and water and space. And we've had to leverage modern technology and infrastructure to the point where it can support, a global population much larger than the natural carrying capacity of the planet. And anything that challenges the stability of that infrastructure is a threat to all of us. And so I think we understand that. I think we now understand how vulnerable we are. We're starting maybe to ask some larger questions about basic issues about environmental sustainability. How do we live sustainably on this planet? So I think it's opened up a conversation, a long needed conversation about some basic issues about whether we can continue on this resource extraction based trajectory that we're on as a civilization.
Has it? Because I feel slightly differently. Like initially, in the first few months of the pandemic, there was this kind of optimism that even that the virus could be this great leveler, that people will suddenly wake up and realize how serious the climate crisis is, and we'll start acting on it, and we'll start cooperating, because that is what is needed with the pandemic, that nations need to cooperate with each other. And same with the climate crisis, nations need to cooperate with each other. But after that, a few months, maybe a month only of optimism, I really haven't seen much of that play out. Do you see that differently?
Yeah, with any crisis, we get to see both the best that our species has to offer and the worst that our species has to offer, and we've seen both here in the United States. We've seen, a movement, a social justice movement that is inspiring, and we're now starting to address these basic issues of racial and cultural injustice that have been simmering for decades, arguably for centuries. And so we're having a reckoning over basic issues of injustice and inequality. And that's a really good thing. At the same time, we saw the worst that our nation has to offer in the form of the January 6th insurrection, which was ultimately inspired by the very worst instincts of our species: nativism, racism, racial animus, selfishness, fear, anger. So again, it's a prism. The pandemic is a prism through which we can see so much of what ails us as a civilization, but we can also see the good in us, and we can see at least flashes of goodness, of progress. And so I don't think the book is yet written on that. I don't think we yet know where we're going to land after we get through this episode. I'm hopeful that we will take away some of these important lessons. A lot of the decisions, for example, that we're making right now here in the United States about our energy infrastructure, there's a battle for how we rebuild. We have a president, Joe Biden. We elected a president who embraces all these challenges that I've described and rejects all of these, again, some of our darker legacies when it comes to racial injustice and inequality, and so it's sort of, we've seen that elections have consequences, and when people come out and vote in mass numbers and they vote for change, for positive change, it makes a difference, and we're seeing that. We have a president now, rather than a president who encouraged racial division, who denied that there was a pandemic and led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, denied that climate change was a problem, and unilaterally pulled out of the Paris Accord and set the worst possible example for the rest of the world as the nation with the greatest legacy of fossil fuel burning, turning back on its obligation to lead on this issue. It would be very easy to have been pessimistic at that time, and many of us were troubled and distraught. But then we saw the emergence again of our better angels, and we elected a president who embraced these challenges, who wants to bring us together, who wants to lead again on climate. And I think that's going to make a huge difference. I think it's going to make a huge difference with countries like India and Australia that have sort of been on the fence when it comes to their climate commitments. I think the United States taking a leadership role again is sending a powerful signal. I think it's going to bring China back to the negotiating table. Remember, China was ahead of their commitments. They were actually doing more than they had promised to do on the climate front until Donald Trump got elected. And then when Trump sort of withdrew US support for climate action, that provided an excuse for other countries to sort of back off with their efforts. India, Australia, China, and others. I think now with the US again in a leadership position, there's reason for cautious optimism, but we can't rest on our laurels. We can't feel like we've won this battle. There's a huge battle ahead. We are dealing with the most powerful industry, most powerful and profitable industry in the history of our planet, the fossil fuel industry, that is using all of its influence and wealth to fight these efforts. It's going to be a monumental battle. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking it will be easy. But we've never shied away from the most important battles here in the United States, or I would argue as a planetary community. And I think we will rise to the occasion here.
Yeah, I think also India's stance has always been that it's kind of overachieving on its Paris agreements, and since its historical emissions are very low, so the developed countries need to do more. So, but coming back to the book that has been written, and coming back to the hope that you talked about. So you are hopeful in your book, and you also speak about doomism, speak against doomism, which is in a sense, on one side you speak about the conservative Murdoch media, on the other hand the doomism, which is primarily coming from the other extreme, from some of the younger activists. So why are you against doomism? Isn't there a great deal of hopelessness? Aren't we doomed? Right? We are at the limit. I mean, we've seen more CO2 atmospheric. The concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere is higher than it has ever been. There are feedback loops which we don't know how exactly they are going to act. The Arctic is melting faster than we thought. What gives you hope?
Yeah. So doomism. The problem with doomism is that often it's premised on a misassessment, a misrepresentation of the science. In many of the doomist narratives that we encounter, for example, this idea that we are already undergoing runaway warming that we can't stop, and all life on Earth will be extinct in 10 years. There's one prominent protagonist in the climate doom made these sorts of statements. And there is no science to support that. There's no science to support this idea that there's an Arctic methane bomb that has exploded and is causing runaway warming. We're measuring methane pretty accurately, and it is increasing, and we have to get it under control. It's not increasing because of permafrost melting and runaway warming. It's increasing mostly because of fossil fuel extraction, methane, and natural gas. We can look at the fingerprint, the isotopic fingerprint of the methane to figure out where it's coming from. It's coming from fossil fuel extraction. So we know what's causing the problem. We know how to solve it. The best science, that we have tells us now that if we stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere, the planet stops warming up. Yes, there are feedback loops that amplify the warming, but there are also natural components in the climate system that take carbon out of the atmosphere, the oceans and the plants on land, what we call the terrestrial biosphere. So if we stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, then those components continue to draw it down, and CO2 concentrations start to drop. So CO2 concentrations slowly drop, but there's still some what we call committed warming just from the CO2 we've already put into the atmosphere as the oceans slowly warm up in response. So we've got this one factor that would cause us to continue to warm, one that would cause us to actually cool. They cancel out, and you basically get a flat line. That's what the models tell us. If we stop burning carbon now, global surface temperatures stabilize within a few years, and all of the impacts that are tied to the warming of the surface of the planet, those stabilize as well. Now, to do that, to avoid crossing, say, the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, where we start to see some of the worst impacts of climate change, we have to decarbonize our economy very quickly. We have to stop CO2 from continuing to rise. And CO2 will increase as long as there is a net input of carbon into the atmosphere. And so to stop it from rising, we've got to bring those carbon emissions down to zero, and we've got to do it within a few decades. We've got to bring them down by a factor of 2 within the next decade, and to net zero emissions by the middle of the century, by 2050. If we are, according to the models, if we are to avert warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of the planet. So we can still do it. There is great urgency, clearly, in acting. We have to act boldly and dramatically, and we have to do it now. but there is agency as well. We can have a direct and immediate impact on this problem, on this crisis, if we act. And so that's the important message that the science teaches us. And what's happened, you allude to the politics of this. What's so pernicious about doomism and despair mongering, and there's some bad actors who are promoting that framing to discourage people, to convince them it's too late. And I detail that in the book. It's pretty clear. But most of the people who fall into that framing, fall for that, are victims of this disinformation campaign. And what's so pernicious is these are mostly people who, as you allude to, are sort of on the progressive side of the political spectrum. They would be the most likely to be out there on the front lines advocating for action. And yet, doomism can lead them to disengagement, to withdraw from the conversation, to give up, to decide that all they can do is just live out their own lives the best they can. It's too late to have an impact. That's very damaging. And so in the book, I point out that some of these very misleading doomist narratives have probably led to a greater amount of disengagement than some of the worst denialist narratives we've encountered, because they're really targeting people who otherwise really would be on the front lines, and they're robbing them of their agency. That's what's so tragic. They're literally robbing them of agency. So when we encounter people like that, let's recognize people who've fallen into doom and despair. They're victims. They're not villains. They're victims of this disinformation. Let's help them through this stage. It may be a stage now that they have to go through. Let's see if we can help them through it and help them to recognize that there still is a possibility to do something and get them back out there, engaged in being part of the solution.
Okay, and what do you think is the role of climate scientists in the new climate war? It was pretty clear in the old climate war, but it seems, now it's pretty much certain that you guys have won that war. You won the old climate war. Everybody accepts global warming is happening. But what is the role, how do you see the role of climate scientists change or pivot in the new climate war? What best can they do? Is doing their science enough, or is effective communication also a key part of a scientist's role now?
Yeah, I think that there's a role for scientists who choose to communicate their science to the public, and it shouldn't be a requirement. There's some scientists who probably best left alone in the laboratory, crunching numbers, doing what they do. That's probably, that's probably their best contribution, where they can best contribute. And because there is a lot of important science left to be done that informs mitigation and adaptation. There's still uncertainties about the regional impacts of climate change, about how rainfall patterns and drought patterns will change in different regions. So there's a lot of science still left to do that is going to inform adaptation and mitigation, because it'll tell us, the more we understand the profound impacts that climate change is likely to have, as we get a better and better understanding of the science, in many respects, we've found that the risks are even greater than we thought. The ice sheets are even less stable than we thought. The Arctic is warming even faster, and the Arctic sea ice is melting even faster. And we're seeing dramatic changes, for example, in the Indian monsoon, which is this important source of water for a huge population. So we still have to continue to do the science and to resolve the uncertainties so we can best, assist the public and policymakers and other stakeholders in using scientific information for dealing, with issues of resilience and adaptation and mitigation and all that. But at the same time, we know enough now to know that climate change is real, it's human caused, and it's already presenting great risk. And so there is a role that scientists who choose to do so, and there should be opportunities for scientists who do want to communicate their science to help them do that and to train them to do that and to provide them opportunities. The scientific community has to be receptive. It wasn't always so receptive. In fact, the great Carl Sagan, who's sort of a hero of mine, a role model of mine, was essentially blackballed from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He was never accepted into the National Academy because of, I think, some animus on the part of other scientists that that it was sort of beneath the dignity of a scientist to do all that public speaking and outreach. It was looked down upon to an extent, or maybe there was some envy and jealousy at all the attention that he got. But it sent just the wrong message. The community that science communicators like Carl Sagan would become pariahs. That's sort of the way it felt decades ago. That has changed. And I think scientists, it's a new generation of scientists who've grown up in the global internet age, where there's a direct on-ramp to public participation through social media. And so it's a natural extension of scientists today to engage in communication. And that has sort of created a whole lot more space. And the scientific societies and organizations have responded by providing training and resources for science communication. It's become one of the major foci within the environmental sciences and in many other areas of science. So that's a good thing. And so today, communicating the science and its implications to the public and to policymakers, I can think of no more worthy undertaking for scientists to engage in. And the good news is there are lots of opportunities to do that because, look, many of the great challenges we face today are fundamentally issues of science-based policy and science-informed policy, whether it's coronavirus or climate change. How we respond to these crises is fundamentally informed by the work of scientists and the work of others trying to communicate the science to the public and policymakers.
So my final question is about your thoughts as a scientist on what you call non-solution solutions. Around the same time your book came out, Bill Gates also wrote his own book on climate change, where he suggests some solutions which could perhaps suck carbon out of the atmosphere, which I understand you don't agree with. So can you tell us in a little bit more detail what you think about that book, about Bill Gates' book, and what do you mean by non-solution solutions?
Yeah, so again, the tactic of delay by the inactivists involves, for example, promoting supposed solutions that aren't real solutions, but keep us in the meantime addicted to fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels, which is what they want. They don't care about the reason that we burn fossil fuels. They just care about the fact that we continue to extract and burn and pay for fossil fuels. So
you're putting Bill Gates in the bracket of inactivists.
Yeah, no, I'm not. So let me be very clear about, my thoughts about Bill Gates and the role that he plays. And I do discuss Bill Gates in the book because, in fact, he had spoken out about many of these things years ago, even before this book came out. And so I do talk about the role that he's played. And look, I think it's great that somebody with the stature and platform of Bill Gates is using that platform to draw attention to the climate crisis. That's a good thing, and I applaud him for that. That having been said, I do think he provides the wrong prescription for solving this, for addressing this crisis. And he does so in part because he downplays the potential for renewable energy. And he actually ignores a pretty substantial literature. There is quite a bit of work over the past few years. Mark Jacobson at Stanford and his collaborators behind the Climate Solutions Project, another group at UC Berkeley, a number of different leading groups in sort of energy systems science have demonstrated that we can decarbonize our economy 80% by 2030 100% by 2050 with existing renewable energy technology and storage technology. Bill Gates sort of neglects that. And he wrongly dismisses the potential for renewable energy to decarbonize our economy on that time scale. And in so doing, that forces him to instead propose riskier alternatives. And those alternatives take the form of nuclear energy, which comes with all sorts of risk. And by the way, it isn't cheap. It's not competitive in the market with renewable energy. So if you're arguing for this on a cost basis, it doesn't make sense. But if you're arguing for it on a safety basis, well, again, it comes with huge potential risks of nuclear proliferation, obviously the environmental contamination by nuclear waste and the problems of long-term burial, being able to bury it safely for the long term. And he promotes geoengineering, and not just direct air capture, which I think is in a separate category. If there is a geoengineering approach that we ultimately do need to seriously think about making part of our toolbox as we confront this crisis, I think that the safest, the idea is we just suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Problem is we're fighting the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of economics in doing that. It's really expensive. It's really hard to do at scale. You know what we're really good at doing? Putting carbon into the atmosphere. We're really good at doing that. We found, very efficient ways to do that. What we're really bad at doing right now, and there's no demonstration as yet that we can do it nearly as well, is taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So there is the danger, even with direct air capture, which would be relatively safe, at least as long as you could store the carbon safely, because there's the potential. You take all this carbon out of the atmosphere, you bury it beneath the ground, but there is tectonic activity, or there is hydrological flow or instability. Something happens down there that sort of impacts the integrity of that carbon store, and you suddenly release all that carbon back into the atmosphere catastrophically. So there are some potential dangers. But it's certainly safer than some of the other geoengineering schemes that Gates also does talk about and promote, like stratospheric aerosols. We shoot particles, sulfur dioxide particles, into the stratosphere to block out some of the incoming sunlight. There are all sorts of potential dangerous side effects and consequences, unintended consequences, if we start to interfere with the global climate system in some other unprecedented and uncontrolled manner. I think some of those strategies are extremely risky. And so again, proposing risky alternatives because he downplays the potential for us to solve this problem with existing technology. Bill Gates has said a couple of things recently. He said in the past, we need a miracle, like we need some dramatic new technology to solve this problem. No, we don't. We've got the solution, renewable energy. We can do this with existing renewable energy and infrastructure. It's just a matter of political will. Something else he said in an interview recently was, well, I don't know the solution to the politics of climate change. Well, if you don't know the solution to the politics, then you don't know the solution, because this isn't a technological problem anymore. We have the technology to solve this problem. It's a problem of political willpower. And so I say to Bill Gates, if you don't have anything to say about how we address the politics of climate action, then step aside, because there are a lot of us who do have some thoughts to contribute on that topic.
On that note, thanks a lot, Michael, for joining us. It was wonderful chatting with you. We wish you all the best for the rest of the quarantine period. Hopefully that's short, that's not too long. And also all the best for the book, and hope it's widely read.
Well, thank you so much. It was great talking with you, and I wish you the best and your compatriots in India. We will get past this. It's going to be a rough road for some ahead, but we will get past this crisis. We will still have to address the looming crisis of climate change, though.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great talking with you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.